There is a number that should not exist. In the year 1944, the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces dropped more than 1.1 million tons of bombs on the Reich. They targeted railways, refineries, and rolling mills. They turned the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants into smoking craters. They reduced Hamburg to a firestorm that created its own weather. By the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare, Germany should have been producing nothing, should have been capable of nothing. The math was categorical. The math was brutal. The math was clear. And yet, tank production in 1944 reached its highest point of the entire war. Artillery pieces rolled off assembly lines in numbers that would have seemed fantastical in 1940. Fighter aircraft, Me-109s, Focke-Wulfs, even the revolutionary Me-262 jet, emerged from factories that, by all reasonable calculation, no longer existed. How do you build 1,000 tanks when the iron ore is at the bottom of a Baltic Sea, swept by enemy submarines? How do you fuel an air force when the refineries at Ploiești are rubble and the wells themselves have run dry? How do you feed a war machine that the entire industrial capacity of 2 continents is conspiring to starve? The answer is, you find an alchemist. You find Albert Speer. In this series, we have examined 3 men who each confronted the mathematics of total war. Friedrich Paulus was broken by the math, consumed at Stalingrad when the equations of supply, encirclement, and attrition became so overwhelming that a field marshal wept in a basement while his army turned to ash. George Marshall organized the math, transforming the vast, sleeping industrial mass of America into a logistical instrument of such precision that it became in itself a weapon more decisive than any single battle. Georgy Zhukov overwhelmed the math with blood, accepting staggering, almost incomprehensible human cost as a legitimate variable in his equations, spending lives the way other commanders spent ammunition. But Speer? Speer did something more dangerous than any of them. Speer tried to lie to the math. He was born in 1905, the son of a prosperous architect. He studied architecture at Munich, at Berlin, at Karlsruhe. He had draftsman's hands and an engineer's mind, and when he first attended a Hitler speech in 1931, he experienced something he would later describe with characteristic cold precision as conversion, not to an ideology, not to a cause. He was converted to the scale of the vision, the audacity of the blueprint. This is the first and most important thing to understand about Albert Speer. He was not motivated by hatred. He was motivated by something, in many ways, worse. He was motivated by the pure, intoxicating pleasure of the problem being solved. He was an architect who saw the Reich not as a moral project, but as a design challenge. And between 1942 and 1945, that design challenge was this: keep a dead empire breathing. When Hitler appointed Speer as Minister of Armaments and War Production in February 1942, following the sudden death of Fritz Todt, the man inheriting the position also inherited a catastrophe. German war production was a feudal disaster, a system of competing fiefdoms, redundant bureaucracies, and ideological interference that made rational planning nearly impossible. Speer streamlined it. He consolidated. He rationalized. He brought the clean language of engineering to a system that had been governed by chaos and party politics. He also inherited something else. He inherited the laborers. By 1944, approximately 7.6 million foreign workers were deployed across the German war economy. The word workers is a bureaucratic courtesy. Many of them were slaves, Soviet POWs, concentration camp prisoners, civilians dragged from occupied Poland, France, Ukraine. Speer knew the numbers. He worked with the numbers. He met with SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, the architect of the death camps, to discuss labor allocation. He visited the Mittelwerk, the underground factory beneath the Harz Mountains, where the V-2 rockets were assembled. At Mittelwerk, The smell was damp salt and unwashed flesh, and something else that those who survived could never quite name. Perhaps the particular odor of human beings who have been reduced to components in a machine. The workers slept in the tunnels. They ate in the tunnels. They died in the tunnels. More people died building the W2 than were ever killed by the W2 in combat. Speer's miracle, you see, was not magic. It was logistics of terror. He found the equation that the Reich's earlier industrial managers had missed. If the cost of labor can be driven to zero, if a human being can be made to cost nothing because their life is already forfeit, because they are already prisoners, already condemned, then the arithmetic of production changes completely. You can build almost anything. You can build everything. The alchemy was real. The ash was real. The transformation was powered by human suffering on a scale that strains language's ability to describe. This is what Albert Speer chose not to remember. Observe for a moment Speer's greatest artistic creation. Not a building, not a city. The Cathedral of Light at Nuremberg. 130 searchlights, each producing a beam visible for 25,000 feet, arranged to create the walls and ceiling of an impossibly vast structure made entirely of illuminated air. British Ambassador Neville Henderson, watching from the crowd, called it both solemn and beautiful. It was the aestheticization of power, the architectural rendering of the Reich's self-image as something transcendent, eternal, divine. The man who designed it told himself always that he was merely a technician. This was Speer's most sophisticated construction, more sophisticated than any building, any rally, any underground factory. It was the architecture of his own self-concept. He was, he insisted, apolitical. He was a manager, a problem solver, a man who received specifications and delivered results. The moral content of those specifications was not his department. His department was the blueprint. Imagine him in the winter of 1942. The Sixth Army is encircled at Stalingrad. Paulus is sending increasingly desperate signals from his frozen pocket in the bend of the Volga. Hundreds of thousands of men are being eaten alive by the arithmetic of encirclement and cold and starvation. Speer is in Berlin. He is bent over drafting tables. He and Hitler are designing Germania, the future capital of the victorious Reich. A triumphal arch so enormous that the Arc de Triomphe could fit inside it. A Volkshalle, a People's Hall, with a dome 17 times the volume of St. Peter's Basilica, in Rome. The city rebuilt as a monument to permanence, to power, to the thousand-year fantasy. He is not thinking about Stalingrad. He is thinking about load-bearing ratios and the reflection of marble under electric light. He is thinking about the problem. He treats it as a problem of engineering, the same way he treats the armaments crisis as a problem of engineering. Get the numbers right. Optimize the system. Deliver the result. This is the seduction of technocracy, and it is a seduction that outlived the Third Reich by many decades. The idea that complex systems can be managed by sufficiently intelligent people who remain morally neutral toward outcomes, who treat human variables with the same detachment they apply to material variables, is not a Nazi idea. It is a thoroughly modern one. Speer simply enacted its terminal logic with greater completeness than most of its proponents prefer to contemplate. The apolitical man, the manager, the genius of organization, the man who signed the labor requisition orders and moved his eyes immediately to the next line item. Return now to the fuel gauge, that instrument we have returned to throughout this series as the essential diagnostic of Germany's strategic condition. By May 1944, following the systematic Allied bombing campaign against the synthetic fuel industry, aviation fuel production in Germany had collapsed by 90%. 90%. Aircraft sat on runways because there was nothing to put in them. Pilots were trained on gliders to conserve fuel. Tank commanders received allocations insufficient to move their vehicles more than a few miles in any direction. Speer saw this. He understood it with perfect clarity. He wrote memos, devastating, analytical memos, detailing the precise rate at which the Reich was being drained of its capacity to continue. He brought these memos to Hitler, who responded reliably with orders to build more, produce more, will the crisis away through the force of Germanic determination. And Speer returned to his desk and tried to solve the problem. The Fischer-Tropsch process, the conversion of coal to synthetic liquid fuel, was Germany's great industrial gamble, the technological bet that might partially compensate for the Reich's catastrophic lack of natural petroleum. Speer threw himself into expanding synthetic fuel production with characteristic ferocity. He allocated labor. He rebuilt bombed facilities with slave workers faster than Allied bombers could destroy them. He reorganized, streamlined, optimized. He was, at moments, genuinely astonishing. A lesser man would have collapsed under the pressure of managing an industrial system being systematically dismantled from the sky. Speer's production numbers are real. His organizational achievements are documented. By any narrow professional metric, he was extraordinary. But here is the terrible arithmetic that Speer, the mathematician of management, refused to calculate honestly. Every tank he built was a coffin requiring a crew. Every aircraft he produced required fuel that did not exist in sufficient quantity to fly it. Every weapon that emerged from his optimized production lines was a tool placed in the hands of a regime whose defeat was not merely probable, but geometrically certain by mid-1944 at the latest. His efficiency did not change the outcome. It extended the duration. It stretched the dying. It consumed additional hundreds of thousands of lives: German soldiers, Allied soldiers, concentration camp prisoners, civilians across a continent, in service of equations that had already resolved themselves into a single, inevitable answer. The miracle of 1944 production was not a miracle. It was the mechanism by which a mathematically decided war was prevented from ending. Speer's genius prolonged the catastrophe. He was the architect of additional suffering. His blueprints were drawn in borrowed time paid for in human lives. Of the 21 major defendants at Nuremberg, only one expressed anything approaching genuine remorse for the war as a whole. That man was Albert Speer. He was also the only one who survived. He acknowledged German guilt. He accepted that the Nazi regime had committed crimes against humanity. He distanced himself from Hitler with measured, articulate clarity. He claimed ignorance of the Holocaust's full dimensions, a claim historians have debated with increasing skepticism in the decades since, as documents have emerged suggesting his knowledge was considerably more complete than his testimony allowed. The Nuremberg judges sentenced him to 20 years in Spandau prison rather than death. He served every day of it. He emerged in 1966 and wrote his memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, which became one of the best-selling accounts of the Nazi period ever published. He presented himself as a witness, a confessor, a man who had looked into the darkness and returned to testify. He died in 1981 in London after giving an interview to the BBC. What are we to make of Albert Speer? He was not a monster in the manner of Himmler or Heydrich. He did not exult in suffering. He did not construct ideology with the enthusiasm of Goebbels or the fanaticism of Bormann. He was, in many ways, exactly what he claimed to be: a technocrat, a manager, a man of blueprints and production schedules. This is precisely why he remains, 7 decades after his trial, the most troubling figure of the entire Reich. Because monsters are, in a certain terrible way, comprehensible. We can categorize them. We can hold them at arm's length with the antiseptic language of pathology and examine them as aberrations, as exceptions to the human condition. Speer was not an exception. Speer was a warning. He showed us what happens when extraordinary intelligence is entirely decoupled from moral accountability, when the pleasure of the problem solved becomes its own sufficient justification. When a human being looks at a labor requisition for 10,000 concentration camp prisoners and sees, first and foremost, a logistics challenge. He built his Cathedral of Light and thought he was creating beauty. He organized his production miracle and thought he was demonstrating excellence. He signed his requisition orders and thought he was simply managing. The searchlights of Nuremberg rose 30,000 feet into the sky, and somewhere beneath them, in the expanding darkness of the Reich, human beings were being consumed by the system that those lights were designed to celebrate. A machine without a soul is just a weapon, and a genius without a conscience is just an architect of ruins.